Welcome. The 4-pawns attack asks a direct question: can white turn a 4-pawn center into an attack before black tears it apart? We begin with the old tactical answers, discover why theory changed, and finish with the modern move order used to challenge the center before white completes development. d4. White controls e5 and c5 and prepares the broadest possible center. Knight f6. Black attacks e4 and keeps both central pawn breaks available. c4. White controls d5 and gains queenside space, but this pawn will later become the target of black's b-pawn break. g6. Black prepares bishop g7, where the bishop will attack the center once the d-pawn moves or disappears. Knight c3. White develops and prepares e4, while the knight also controls d5. Bishop g7. The bishop appears blocked, but its pressure against d4 becomes tactical as soon as that pawn advances. e4. White now controls the central dark squares and gains space, but e4 becomes black's permanent target. d6. Black restrains e5 and prepares either e5 or c5 without committing the king. f4. White supports e5 and takes more space. The cost is another pawn move before development and a weaker diagonal toward the king. Castles. Historically, black secured the king first and only then attacked the center. Knight f3. White supports e5, protects d4, and prepares to castle. Black must strike now, before the remaining pieces coordinate. Black can strike with e5, develop with knight a6 before playing e5, or attack d4 with c5. The old main line shows c5 after castling. Its purpose is to force the d-pawn forward so the bishop on g7 can see the e5 and b2 squares. c5. Black attacks d4 with a flank pawn, hoping to make the white center move before white castles. d5. White preserves space and removes the d-pawn from the bishop's diagonal, but fixes e4 as a target. e6. Black attacks the head of white's d5 chain and prepares to open the e-file. Bishop e2. White develops without blocking the queen's support of d3 and prepares king safety before playing e5. E takes d5. Black removes the space pawn so that white must choose which pawn rebuilds the center. C takes d5. White preserves the e-pawn as an attacking unit and keeps e5 available. Taking with the e-pawn would leave e4 weak and make f4 look misplaced. Before the historical main line, consider b5. Black attacks c4 immediately and offers a pawn to open files while white's king remains in the center. Bishop takes b5. White wins a pawn, but the bishop moves a second time and black gains targets on e4 and d5. Knight takes e4. The point is that open lines and development matter more than the sacrificed b-pawn. Now return 3 moves to the position after c takes d5. The b-pawn sacrifice is playable, but old theory placed the rook on the e-file and challenged white to prove the e5 advance. Rook e8. Black attacks e4 indirectly and places the rook opposite white's king, but leaves the f3 knight untouched. That detail gives white a forcing break. Pause the video here. White is behind in development, yet one central move forces black to react. Find the move that uses the f-pawn and attacks the knight on f6. e5. White gains time on the knight and uses the f4 pawn to rebuild the center after an exchange. D takes e5. Retreating the knight would allow e takes d6 and leave black cramped, so black removes the advanced pawn before choosing a knight square. F takes e5. White replaces the pawn with tempo against the f6 knight and opens the f-file toward black's king. Knight g4. Black attacks e5 and creates tactical pressure on the dark squares. A passive retreat would leave white's center intact. Bishop g5. White protects the center tactically by pinning the queen and prepares to castle with pressure. Queen b6. Black attacks b2, steps out of the pin, and adds pressure to e5 in one move. Castles. White completes development just in time and connects the rook to the tactical e-file. Knight takes e5. Black can finally capture because the queen has left d8 and the pieces are ready to meet the exchange. Knight takes e5. White removes the active knight and forces the bishop to reveal black's compensation. Bishop takes e5. Black's bishop becomes active, but white has gained development and pressure. This is playable, yet black has allowed white the initiative. Queen d2. White develops the queen, supports the bishop on g5, and prepares rook moves against the center. Bishop f5. Black develops and controls the central dark squares, reaching a dynamically balanced position after a long forcing sequence. The old rook move survives, but it gives white exactly the e5 break the four pawns attack was designed to play. Black spends several only-purpose moves neutralizing the center. Theory therefore looked for a move that develops while removing white's most important support of e5. Return to the position after 9c takes d5. Instead of moving the rook first, black can develop the c8 bishop and challenge the knight that makes e5 dangerous. Bishop g4. Black develops with a concrete purpose, exchange the f3 knight, reduce the force of e5, and clear the queenside for development. Castles. White refuses to lose time and makes the rook available to support e4. Knight bd7. Black supports e5 and c5 and prepares queenside play without exposing the queen. Before the direct main line, examine rook e1. White reinforces e4 before asking the bishop to decide. Rook e8. Black attacks the same pawn and has inserted bishop g4, so white's e5 break carries less force than in the old line. Rewind rook e1 and rook e8. White's most direct question is h3, forcing black to justify the bishop move immediately. h3. White asks whether the bishop retreats or completes its mission on f3. First consider bishop h5. Black tries to preserve the bishop, but white can gain space and threaten to trap it. g4. White attacks the bishop and expands with tempo. Black has failed to reduce the power of white's center. Rewind g4 and bishop h5. Black should complete the strategic exchange instead of preserving the bishop at the cost of time. Bishop takes f3. Black gives up the bishop pair to remove the piece that supports e5, protects h4, and helps white coordinate. Bishop takes f3. White gains the bishop pair, but this bishop must also defend e4 and can become tied to the center. Rook e8. This is the same rook move as the old main line, but now the f3 knight is gone. White cannot launch e5 with the same force. Return to the position after 6 knight f3. The bishop exchange improved the c5 system, but black also discovered a different idea: develop one more piece before striking with e5. Knight a6. The knight prepares c5, where it will attack e4 after the d-pawn moves, while leaving the c8 bishop unblocked. Bishop e2. White prepares to castle and keeps both central captures available. e5. Black attacks the center before white castles and accepts that one pawn may be offered for development and the d-file. First examine castling. It looks safe, but it lets black clarify the center while the knight on d4 will be exposed to the g7 bishop. E takes d4. Black removes the pawn that blocked the g7 bishop. Knight takes d4. The knight looks active, but it now stands on the bishop's diagonal. Knight c5. Black attacks e4 and brings the a6 knight to its intended square. Bishop f3. White protects e4, but places another piece on the same tactical network. Rook e8. Black increases the pressure before revealing the tactical point. Rook e1. White appears to have solved the problem, but black has one developing move that pins the defender. Bishop g4. If white captures, the g7 bishop wins the knight on d4. The center is overloaded, which is why castling on move 8 was inaccurate. Rewind to the position after 7 e5. White should not allow black to open the center on ideal terms. The principled response is to capture immediately. First consider f takes e5. White keeps the d-pawn on d4, but after the exchange the e5 pawn can become a target. D takes e5. Black exchanges the center and prepares c5 or knight c5 against the remaining pawns. Knight takes e5. White has an extra pawn, but black can attack the knight and the d4 base with c5 and knight moves. c5. Black immediately attacks the pawn supporting the knight and uses the lead in development. Rewind to move 8 again. Taking with the d-pawn opens the d-file but gives white the cleanest version of the extra pawn attempt. It also leads to the tactical sequence every advanced player must know. D takes e5. White removes black's e-pawn and opens the d-file before castling. D takes e5. Black restores a central pawn and opens the d-file toward white's king. Knight takes e5. White accepts the challenge, relying on accurate calculation to survive the open files. Knight c5. Black attacks e4 and brings a new piece into the center with tempo. Bishop f3. White keeps the extra pawn and reinforces e4, but the king remains in the center. Queen takes d1 check. Black exchanges queens specifically so white's king must occupy the open file. King takes d1. The rook cannot recapture because it begins on a 1, so the king is drawn onto black's active file. Rook d8 check. Black gains another tempo and forces the king toward c2. King c2. White preserves the extra pawn, but the pieces around e4 and e5 are pinned and overloaded. Pause the video. A quiet move lets white consolidate the extra pawn and bishop pair. Black has one tactical move that temporarily sacrifices a knight, opens the bishop, and guarantees the material returns. Find it before continuing. Knight f takes e4. Black's only forcing continuation removes a defender and opens lines while white's king is exposed. Knight takes e4. White takes the offered piece, but black's bishop now develops with tempo against the knight and king. Bishop f5. Black develops, pins the knight's movement to the exposed king, and prepares bishop takes e5. Rook e1. White protects the knight and e-pawn, but black can eliminate the central defender. Bishop takes e5. Black exchanges the bishop for the knight and restores the material balance through the open files. F takes e5. White keeps a pawn on e5, but the rook now has an entry square on d4. Rook d4. Black attacks e4 and uses the fourth rank to regain the pawn. This active rook is the compensation promised by the original e5 sacrifice. Now return to the position immediately after 5f4, before black castles and before white develops knight f3. Modern theory asks whether black can attack d4 at once and deny white a free developing move. c5. Black attacks d4 before castling. Compared with the old order, white has not yet developed knight f3, and black keeps the option to castle only when it is useful. First examine d takes c5. White abandons the broad center to win a temporary pawn. Castles. Black does not rush to regain c5. The exposed e4 pawn and queen checks on a5 or b6 provide the compensation. Rewind to the position after 5c5. Developing knight f3 is natural, but black can exchange on d4 before white forces the usual closed structure. Knight f3. White keeps every central option open and prepares to castle. C takes d4. Black removes the d-pawn before it can advance and opens the g7 bishop's diagonal. Knight takes d4. White centralizes, but the knight can now be challenged by knight c6. Knight c6. Black develops with tempo and asks whether white exchanges or retreats. Knight takes c6. White gives up the d5 outpost to avoid losing time. B takes c6. Black accepts doubled pawns in return for the open b file, control of d5, and pressure on e4. Rewind to the position after 5c5. White's most principled answer is d5, keeping the space advantage and asking black to prove the center can be undermined. d5. White keeps the 4-pawn idea intact and closes the g7 bishop for the moment. Castles. With d5 fixed, black can secure the king and prepare e6 without allowing a favorable immediate e5. Knight f3. White reinforces e5 and prepares to castle. e6. Black attacks the advanced pawn and prepares the Benoni transformation. Before the main development, examine d takes e6. White releases d5 and gives black a choice of recapture. F takes e6. Black preserves the dark squared bishop, opens the f file, and prepares d5. The doubled-looking pawns control important central squares. Bishop e2. White prepares to castle and watches the e6 pawn, but black's next goal is active central play rather than passive defense. Rewind to the position after 7e6. Bishop d3 looks more active than bishop e2 because it protects e4, but its placement gives black a modern queenside resource. Bishop d3. White directly protects e4 and supports an e5 advance. E takes d5. Black forces the central recapture before striking on the wing. C takes d5. White keeps e5 available, but the bishop on d3 has spent a tempo and stands exposed to queenside tactics. Pause the video. Black should not make a slow developing move. Find the pawn break that attacks the c4 base and uses white's uncastled king and exposed bishop. b5. Black attacks c4 immediately and offers a pawn for open lines. The move is stronger with the bishop on d3 because white has spent a tempo placing it on a tactical diagonal. Bishop takes b5. White wins the pawn, but black can attack e4 and use queen checks before white castles. Knight takes e4. Black's compensation is concrete, a central pawn, development with tempo, and an exposed king. Rewind to the position after 7e6. Bishop e2 is the steadier main line because it prepares castling without stepping onto the d-file or giving black the same b-pawn tempo. Bishop e2. White prepares to castle and keeps the bishop away from queenside tactics. E takes d5. Black removes the advanced pawn before white completes development. C takes d5. We have reached the familiar Benoni structure, but the move order explains why both sides arrived here. Before the modern main line, consider b5. Black offers the queenside pawn to pull a white piece away from the center and open lines before white castles. Bishop takes b5. The c-pawn has already moved to d5, so the bishop is the natural piece to accept the gambit. Knight takes e4. Black uses the bishop's second move and white's uncastled king to recover a central pawn with activity. Rewind to the position after 9c takes d5. The old rook move allowed e5, and bishop g4 exchanged the supporting knight. The modern approach develops a knight first and waits to see whether white commits the center. Knight b d7. Black develops, supports c5 and e5, and refuses to reveal the rook or bishop placement before white chooses a plan. First test the old reaction, e5. It gains space, but black has prepared the center without placing the rook where tactics arrive with tempo. D takes e5. Black exchanges the spearhead immediately. F takes e5. White attacks the f6 knight, but the advanced pawn lacks the same tactical support as in the old rook line. Knight g4. Black attacks e5, exploits the uncastled king, and can add queen pressure without having lost a tempo to rook e8. Rewind to the position after 9 knight b d7. Since the immediate e5 break no longer forces the issue, white should complete development and preserve the option for a better moment. Castles. White secures the king and brings the rook toward e1 before deciding whether to play e5 or build on the queen side. Rook e8. Now the rook move is well timed because the knight on d7 helps control the central breaks. Rook e1. White protects e4 and prepares bishop e3, queen d2, or knight d2 to c4. a6. Black prepares b5 and asks white to react on the queen side instead of launching e5 immediately. a4. White slows b5 and fixes queenside squares, but creates b4 as a potential outpost. Rook b8. Black increases support for b5 and keeps the central pieces flexible. Knight d2. White reroutes the knight to c4, where it can pressure d6 and help control b6 and e5. b5. Black finally opens the queen side. The modern system has not refuted white's space, it has forced white to defend it while black develops every piece with purpose. Pause one last time. Do not search for a forcing tactic. Identify white's best strategic task and black's source of counterplay. White should contest c4 and d6, black should open queenside files before white stabilizes the center. The history of this opening is the history of timing. The old rook e8 line allowed e5 with tempo. Bishop g4 improved black's play by removing the knight that supports that break. Knight a6 created a tactical e5 sacrifice and the famous knight takes e4 combination. Modern theory improves the move order again with immediate c5, uses b5 against exposed development, and reaches knight bd7 before committing the other pieces. For white, space is valuable only when development protects it. For black, counterplay works only when every move attacks the center or opens a file.